Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Thank you very much for joining me today. During the last episode, we started talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and how they related to ISO standards. So just to recap about the SDG. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was adopted by all United Nations member states back in 2015, provides a shared blueprint, and that's a blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and in the future. And at its heart are those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and we covered the first 9 in the previous episode, and I'm going to be covering 10 to 17 in this episode today. Because at the end of the day, we have got an urgent call for action by all countries to address these 17 goals. That's both in the developed and developing countries. It is truly a global partnership, and at the end of this podcast we'll be looking at Goal 17, which is how ISO standards play a part in that global partnership. But all 17 Sustainable Development Goals recognise, that ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality, and of course spur economic growth as well, but at the same time trying to tackle climate change whilst working to preserve our oceans and our forests. So without further ado, I'm going to dive straight into the remaining Sustainable Development Goals that we touched upon. Now, some of you that are listening might be thinking, well, I only cover ISO 9001, what's that got to do with the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, when you go into the ISO.org website, you'll be able to see that 9001 alone covers 4 SDGs, 4 Sustainable Development Goals. If you look at ISO 14001, which I know that many of our ISO show listeners will be certified against, that actually covers 12 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so I won't continue on because I'm keen to get stuck into the 10th SDG, which is reduced inequalities. But I just wanted to kind of put it into context that a lot of the work that you're currently doing is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we could be doing a lot more. So in terms of goal number 10, reduced inequalities, many developing countries are suffering from a lack of standards, which can be a major impediment to their integration into regional and global markets, which in turn can limit the opportunities that are offered by trade. And then, obviously, the knock-on effect of that is that it's hindering the ability to improve public welfare in vital areas such as health and safety and environmental protection. But ISO standards themselves contribute to the reduction of these inequalities because they serve as a common language. We know that these ISO standards are applicable to all businesses across all sectors of all sizes, regardless of where you're located in the world. So they do truly represent a common language of best practice, which ultimately helps to break down barriers to trade. They can help to promote innovation and also level up the playing field for organisations of all types wishing to compete at a higher level, whether that's at national or international level. And we know that firsthand that this is true. I've mentioned this story a couple of times on the podcast, but we had a guy who was working from his garage. It was him and his wife, and they knew that they wanted to achieve ISO standards in order to be able to grow their business, to have a sustainable business, and to act responsibly and do the right thing. And they did. They implemented ISO 9001, 14001 and 45. So that's quality, environment and health and safety. And they went on to becoming a really successful organisation, turning over millions. So I think it just proves a point that this does help to level up the playing field. Many organisations come to us because they want to achieve better standards, but they also want to be able to pitch for bigger contracts as well. So it does help to address any kind of imbalances in that area in business. But when we're looking at it from a social responsibility perspective, the main standard I would suggest here is ISO 26000. So that's the guidance standard. So it's not a specification, it's not a certification standard that you will get a badge for, but it's a fantastic tool to provide you with all the information that you need on social responsibility. Okay, so it provides guidelines on how you can operate in a socially responsible way. So this is all about addressing inequalities, which includes encompassing, the principles of non-discrimination and, of course, equal opportunities. So moving on to Sustainable Development Goal number 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities. So the flagship standard for sustainable cities and communities is ISO 37101. Okay, so that's 37101, which helps communities define their sustainable development objectives. What do they want to achieve, how are they going to get there, and implementing the strategies in order to be able to achieve them. So this covers a lot of different areas such as responsible use of resources, preserving the environment, and improving the well-being of citizens within those sustainable cities and communities. And due to its increasing popularity, there's now a series of standards, including ISO 37120, which are the indicators for city services and quality of life. And there's a couple of up-and-coming standards in this area as well in the same series, which are the indicators for smart cities and resilient cities. So they're 37122 and 37123. But there's also literally hundreds of standards on intelligent transport systems, water management, business continuity, and community resilience. Okay, so one of those standards that you've probably heard of is ISO 22301 on business continuity management. But this is all about creating a resilient future. Okay, it's building in resilience into our way of life so that we can become more sustainable and adaptive to the challenges that we all face. So moving on to SDG number 12, responsible consumption and production. I think we know and recognise that we are a wasteful society. In 2022, people leave lights on, they leave all sorts of electrical appliances on 24/7. We've got fast fashion and the issues with that. And then we've got this throwaway society. I mean, if we look at food, for example, many people will throw out food that maybe a day past its sell-by date, but it's actually fine to eat. So I think all in all, we do recognise that we do live in a wasteful society. I know that many people are being more environmentally friendly and recycling and reusing, which is fantastic, but I think that there is still a long way to go. Reducing our environmental impact and promoting the use of renewable sources of energy and encouraging responsible purchasing decisions are just some of the ways that ISO standards contribute to sustainable consumption and production. So one example of this is that ISO have developed standards for environmental labelling, which is the ISO 14020 series. So that's 14020. So these provide the guiding principles for the development and use of environmental labels and also self-declarations as well. So this helps to prepare for third-party certification programs, which can ultimately help invalidate environmental claims on all sorts of different types of products and therefore encourage customers to make better choices. And I think this is a really interesting area because consumers now led quite often not only by price but also on the environmental credentials of that product and service. It is a key influencing factor. Sustainability also is highly relevant when it comes to construction. Okay, so ISO 15392 looks at sustainability in building construction, which looks at sustainability in buildings through their whole life cycle, from inception through to end of life. And interestingly, when I was talking earlier about this throwaway society, there is a standard ISO 20245. And by the way, these notes will be, the numbers of these standards will be included in the show notes. I'm not expecting you to remember them or necessarily write them all down. But this particular standard covers the trade of second-hand goods, which is looking at establishing minimum screening criteria for certain goods traded between countries and organisations, which obviously can help to drive an alternative way of reducing waste and environmental impact. So moving on to SDG 13, which is a really hot topic. We've covered it so much when it comes to certain carbon standards and environmental standards, and SDG 13 is climate action. Okay, so ISO has a number of standards that play an essential role in the climate agenda, which are there to help to monitor climate change, quantify greenhouse gas emissions, and promote good practice in environmental management. So one standard that I'm sure that many of you have heard of is ISO 14001. So that is part of the ISO 14000 family of standards when it comes to environmental management. And they detail all sorts of practical tools for organisations to manage the impact that their business has on the environment. So ISO 14001 is still the most popular environmental management system standard. And it just provides a fantastic framework that covers everything from objectives to your audits, communication, life cycle analysis, and it helps you to put controls in place to be able to mitigate and adapt to climate change. When it comes to focusing on greenhouse gas protocols and compatibility with most GHG programs, ISO 14064 certainly fits the bill here. So that standard, and we've covered it on previous podcasts, so please do go back and listen to our podcast on ISO 14064 and carbonology. It basically provides a framework for carbon footprint quantification. It then enables you to be able to monitor, validate and verify your GHG, and obviously we've covered this in a lot of detail. We haven't touched on another standard, which is ISO 14067, which is again still in the 14000 family. And this particular standard specifies the principles and requirements for quantifying and reporting the carbon footprint of products. So if you produce a product, ISO 14064 is something that you might be interested in looking into. But the ISO 14064 that we've covered in great detail on previous podcasts can be applied to businesses. So they apply to your business activities. And finally, I can't leave the Climate Action SDG without mentioning PAS 2060. So PAS 2060 is the framework for carbon neutrality. Okay, so we know that there's a lot of greenwashing going on at the moment, and organisations making a pledge or paying lip service to being carbon neutral, but this is actually a proven methodology that you can actually get verification for. Again, if you want to find out any more information about the carbon standards, environmental and energy standards, then please do drop us a line and we'll be happy to help. Actually, we also have an ISO support plan, which I should have mentioned in the previous episode, which can help you to align the Sustainable Development Goals with your management system. So feel free to drop us a line about that as well. That's the ISO support plan service that we offer, that we can weave and dovetail ISO standards into your management system so that it's better aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Anyway, enough of that pitch. Let's move on to SDG number 14, which is where we're going to dive below water. Okay, so we recognise that there is a depletion of resources on land, but it's also very much the case in relation to life below water, which is SDG number 14. The traceability of fish and environmental management of marine resources are the focus of a technical committee, an ISO technical committee for fisheries and aquaculture. And they are doing a ton of work in relation to the development of standards in this space. So this is all about, being respectful in terms of life underwater. But in addition to this, there are over 250 sustainability-related standards relating to environmental matters concerning shipping. Okay, and this covers, from the design and construction to the equipment and technology used. Why is this important? Well, it all relates back to marine environmental protection, such as responses to oil spills and the management of port waste reception facilities as well. So it's all interrelated. So talking about back on land, talking about port waste reception facilities, this takes us now on to goal number 15. So the SDG 15 is life on land. So we all know that protecting and promoting life on land through better use of resources is a key objective of hundreds of ISO standards. So I'll just mention two. One is the good old ISO 14001, but another one is ISO 38200. Okay, so 38200 is the chain of custody of wood and wood-based products. So the purpose of this standard is to promote traceability. Okay, traceability by encouraging greater use of wood from sustainable sources, which is absolutely essential to help combat illegal deforestation. So they're just two standards that I've just briefly touched on for the Life on Land Sustainable Development Goal number 15. Okay, so moving on to the last two Sustainable Development Goals, which brings us on to number 16, for peace, justice and strong institutions. A good practice for effective governance covers a wide range of aspects, from the direction of an organisation, control and accountability. And that includes compliance, looking at corruption as well, and also whistleblowing. So that's peace, justice and strong institutions. Its most prominent standard in this area is ISO 37001, the Anti-Bribery Management System Standard, which helps to promote peace, justice and strong institutions by increasing transparency and accountability. This standard is a certifiable standard. We have covered it on a previous podcast, and it can be integrated quite easily into ISO 9001. In our experience, it's mostly been implemented in the UK in the construction and fit-out sectors. And what it does is it provides an effective way to demonstrate accountability, and it helps to be inclusive to societies and institutions that need to rely on good governance at all levels. And this is applicable to all sizes of organisations, from small companies right through to multinationals and, of course, governments as well. But further standards in relation to 37001 is 37301, which is compliance management systems, and then finally ISO 37000, governance of organisations. So there are a couple of standards for you to look into if this is an area that you're aligning a sustainable development goal with. And finally, this brings us to number 17, partnership for the goals. Now, although this is last, I think it's so relevant in the area of work that we deal with ISO standards. So although it's the last, definitely not the least sustainable development goal. So number 17 is focused on strengthening the means of implementation and revitalising the global partnership for sustainable development. Now, in my view, obviously this is just my personal view, ISO stands for working towards a common standard of best practice together to get impactful results. And ISO standards, can only exist because of people like you. Okay, they can only exist by people like you, industries, technical committees, across the globe coming together to define what best practice actually is, agreeing on it and implementing it. Now, many of you are involved with technical committees, getting involved in the development of standards, implementing standards, auditing standards, and it's down to people like you and me to be able to do that. Okay, and these standards bring people together to implement these best practice standards which contribute to our sustainable development. And I know, it's easier said than done. These ISO standards aren't just made up, on the back of a cigarette packet. These are standards that have been developed over a long time. An ISO standard, for those of you that don't know, is developed with the collaboration and consensus of a wide range of stakeholders from across the globe, from all corners of the earth, including representatives from government, industry, and standards bodies. So it does take literally years to go through this process for each ISO standard, but in my humble opinion, I think it's worth it. Because now, more than ever, it's a time to implement these best practice frameworks to create a more sustainable future for our planet and our people. During the course of this podcast and the previous one, we've touched on many different ISO standards that can be used in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. So why not use them? Why not embrace them? Because I think we need to recognise the importance of global partnerships that the ISO standards landscape brings, and that we, as a nation in the UK and across the globe, depend on. So that concludes my two-part overview of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But I would like to leave you with one question. What role do you play? How can your role as an ISO standards champion, and I know you are one if you're listening to this, by the way, how can your role as an ISO standards champion make a difference by implementing these Sustainable Development Goals? So I'd love it if you could ask yourself that question. What role do you play? And then go and take action. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show. Well, I'll share some tips for aligning the SDG goals, so the Sustainable Development Goals, with your ISO system. So there's just a few tips. It's not going to be an answer to all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I'm afraid. Just a few hints and tips on how you can do that. So thanks once again for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a review when you get the chance, as this really does help our podcast to grow its audience so that we can continue to share tips and dispel myths around ISO standards. I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.